Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. 2 years ago, I walked into a coffee shop on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was in a bad mood, stressed from work, and running on 3 hours of sleep. The rain had soaked through my shoes, and my favorite jacket was ruined. The last thing I expected was for that day to change my life. I ordered my usual, black coffee, no sugar, and looked around for a place to sit. The shop was unusually crowded, probably because everyone else was also seeking refuge from the rain. That's when I saw her. She was sitting at a corner table, her hair tied up in a messy bun, her laptop open in front of her. She was wearing an oversized sweater and had a notebook filled with messy handwriting. She looked so focused, scribbling furiously, and occasionally biting the end of her pen. The only empty chair was across from her. "Is this seat taken?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She looked up, her big brown eyes meeting mine, and smiled. "No, go ahead." For the next hour, we sat in silence, each lost in our own world. But something about her presence felt comforting. As I got up to leave, I couldn't resist saying, "Whatever you're working on, you look really passionate about it." She blushed and laughed softly. "Thanks. It's just some freelance writing stuff. Not that exciting." I left thinking that was the end of it, but life had other plans. A week later, I was back at the same coffee shop, and there she was again. This time she waved at me. I waved back, and before I knew it, we were sharing a table again. One thing led to another, and soon we were talking. She told me her name was Emma. She was a freelance journalist who wrote about travel and culture, and she was saving up to go on a solo trip to Europe. I told her about my boring office job, my love for cooking, and how I secretly wanted to quit everything and start a food blog. She listened with such genuine interest that I found myself opening up in a way I hadn't done with anyone in years. We started meeting at the coffee shop every week, sometimes by coincidence, sometimes on purpose. Our conversations grew deeper. She'd tell me about her dreams of seeing the northern lights, and I'd tell her about my grandmother's secret lasagna recipe. It wasn't long before our coffee shop meetups turned into dinner dates, movie nights, and weekend adventures. She taught me how to embrace spontaneity, to see beauty in the mundane, and to take risks. I, in turn, showed her how to slow down and savor the little things. Together, we balanced each other in a way that felt effortless. But then came the challenge, her Europe trip. She had been planning it for years, and it was finally happening. 6 months away from each other. "I don't want to lose what we have," she said, her voice trembling. I reassured her, even though I was terrified. We promised to call, text, and send postcards. We even joked about how old-fashioned it sounded. The distance was hard. Time zones and bad Wi-Fi made it harder. But every time I saw her name light up my phone, my heart raced. She sent me pictures of sunsets in Italy, cobblestone streets in Prague, and snowy mountains in Switzerland. And every postcard she sent ended with, "Wish you were here." When she finally came back, I was waiting for her at the airport with a bouquet of sunflowers, her favorite. The moment she saw me, she dropped her suitcase and ran into my arms. "I missed you," she whispered. "I missed you more," I replied. That night, as we sat on my couch eating pizza and laughing about how terrible airplane food is, I knew. I knew she was the one. A month ago, I proposed to her in that same coffee shop where we first met. I had the barista write, "Will you marry me?" on the side of her cup. She laughed and cried at the same time, and of course, she said yes. Now we're planning our wedding. It's going to be small, just close friends and family, in a little garden with fairy lights and lots of sunflowers. Life is unpredictable, messy, and sometimes downright cruel. But every once in a while, it surprises you with something beautiful. For me, that something beautiful is Emma. What do you think? It all started with a wallet, or more specifically, with me losing mine. 3 years ago, I was in New York City for a work conference. I was exhausted, having been stuck in back-to-back meetings and trying to navigate the chaos of Manhattan during rush hour. By the time I realized my wallet was missing, I was already on the subway heading back to my hotel. Panic set in. My credit cards, ID, and even a tiny photo of my late grandmother were in there. Retracing my steps was impossible. I'd been in so many places that day. All I could do was file a report at the subway's Lost and Found and cancel my cards. The next morning, I got an email from someone named Lily. The subject line read, "I think I found your wallet." I opened it immediately. "Hi, I found a wallet on a subway bench last night. It has your ID in it, so I'm guessing it's yours? Let me know how I can get it back to you." Relief flooded over me. I responded quickly, thanking her profusely and offering to meet her wherever was convenient. She replied, suggesting a cafe in Brooklyn. I hesitated for a moment. Brooklyn was out of my way, but how could I say no to the person who had just saved me from a nightmare? The cafe was small and cozy, with mismatched furniture and the smell of freshly baked pastries. I spotted her right away. She was sitting by the window, holding my wallet in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. Lily looked radiant. She had long, dark curls that framed her face, and she wore an oversized sweater that made her seem effortlessly cool. When she saw me, she smiled and waved. "Thanks for coming all the way out here," she said as she handed me the wallet. "I'm glad I could track you down." "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched. "You're a lifesaver." We ended up talking for an hour, then 2, then 3. What started as polite small talk turned into a deep conversation about everything. Our jobs, our hobbies, our favorite books. I learned that Lily was an artist who created murals for community spaces. She had a passion for making cities feel alive and welcoming. When I finally checked the time, it was almost 10 p.m. Embarrassed, I apologized for keeping her so long. She laughed. "I didn't mind. You're easy to talk to." After that day, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I emailed her later that week to thank her again, and she replied with a message that ended with, "Let me know if you're ever in Brooklyn again." I was scheduled to fly back home to Chicago that weekend, but I couldn't resist. I extended my trip by a day and asked if she'd like to meet up again. We spent the next day exploring Brooklyn together. She showed me her favorite spots, a quirky bookstore, a rooftop garden, and a street covered in colorful murals. By the time the sun set, I was completely smitten. When I told her I had to leave the next morning, she looked genuinely disappointed. "You'll visit again, right?" she asked. "I will," I promised. What followed was a whirlwind of long-distance communication. We texted, called, and sent each other ridiculous memes at all hours of the day. Every few weeks, one of us would fly out to see the other. We explored each other's cities, introduced each other to our friends, and fell more in love with every visit. Of course, it wasn't always easy. There were times when the distance felt unbearable. Once, after a particularly bad fight about whose turn it was to visit, I thought we wouldn't make it. But Lily showed up at my apartment unannounced 2 days later, holding a bouquet of sunflowers, my favorite. She apologized, and we promised to always put in the effort, no matter how hard it got. A year into our relationship, I got a job offer in New York. It was a big step up in my career, but the real reason I accepted it was Lily. I wanted to be closer to her. Moving to New York wasn't easy. I missed my friends and family in Chicago, but being with Lily made it worth it. We found a small apartment together in Queens and spent our weekends painting the walls, assembling IKEA furniture, and learning how to coexist in the same space. One night, as we sat on our tiny balcony drinking wine, she turned to me and said, "You know, if I hadn't found your wallet that day, we might have never met." I smiled. I guess I owe the universe one. 2 months ago, I proposed to her in front of one of her murals. It was a colorful depiction of a city skyline with the words, "Home is where the heart is." She said yes. Now, we're planning our wedding and dreaming about the future. Some days, I still marvel at how a lost wallet brought us together. So, to anyone reading this who's feeling like love will never come their way, hang in there. Sometimes the universe works in mysterious, magical ways, and if you ever lose your wallet, maybe it's not such a bad thing after all. 3 years ago, I thought I had my life figured out. I had a stable job, a small but cozy apartment in Seattle, and a circle of friends who felt like family. But if I'm being honest, something was missing. Deep down, I was lonely. I wasn't actively looking for love. Past heartbreaks had left me cautious, maybe even jaded. So when I met Emily, it wasn't through a dating app or at some party. It was the kind of meet cute that sounds like it belongs in a cheesy rom-com. It all started on a snowy evening in February. I had just finished a late shift at work and stopped by my favorite bookstore to grab something new to read. It was one of those little independent stores with creaky wooden floors and shelves that seemed to stretch endlessly. The kind of place where time stands still. As I was browsing the fiction section, I heard a loud crash from the next aisle. Curious, I peeked around the corner and saw her, Emily, kneeling on the floor, surrounded by books she'd accidentally knocked over. "Need some help?" I asked, trying not to laugh at the sheer chaos she'd created. She looked up at me with wide, embarrassed eyes and a sheepish smile. "I swear I'm not usually this clumsy," she said, brushing her hair out of her face. I knelt down to help her pick up the books, and we started chatting. She told me she was a kindergarten teacher, looking for a book to read on her snow day. I joked that knocking over half the store was a bold way to ask for recommendations. We ended up talking for nearly an hour. The bookstore employees were probably annoyed that we were loitering, but neither of us seemed to care. Before we parted ways, she asked, "Do you want to grab a coffee sometime? You know, as a thank you for rescuing me from my book avalanche." I said yes. Our first coffee date turned into a 3-hour conversation about everything and nothing. She told me about her passion for teaching and how she loved seeing the world through her students' eyes. I told her about my dream of writing a novel one day, though I'd never admitted that to anyone before. From there, things progressed naturally. We started seeing each other regularly, and every date felt like peeling back another layer of this incredible person. Emily had this infectious energy that made even the most mundane activities, grocery shopping, folding laundry, feel special. But what truly won me over was her kindness. She remembered the little things, like how I took my coffee or that I hated the sound of alarm clocks. Once, when I mentioned how much I missed my mom's lasagna, she spent an entire Saturday trying to recreate the recipe. It wasn't perfect, but it was the sweetest gesture anyone had ever done for me. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. About 6 months into our relationship, Emily got an offer to work at a prestigious school in Chicago. It was her dream job, but it was 2,000 miles away. "I don't want to lose what we have," she said one night, her voice trembling. "But I also can't pass this up." I told her I understood, even though the thought of her leaving broke my heart. We decided to try long distance. The first few months were tough. There were nights when all I wanted was to hold her, but all I had was the sound of her voice over the phone. We visited each other as often as we could, but saying goodbye every time was like ripping off a Band-Aid. Still, we made it work. We sent each other care packages. She once mailed me a box of homemade cookies and a little note that said, "Something sweet for someone sweet." I surprised her with handwritten letters because she said emails didn't feel personal enough. Over time, the distance became less daunting. We found our rhythm, and our love grew stronger because of it. A year later, I flew to Chicago to visit her. We were walking through Millennium Park, admiring the city lights, when she turned to me and said, "You know, I've been thinking about coming back to Seattle." I was stunned. "What about your job?" She shrugged. "Jobs come and go, but I don't want to spend another year without you." I didn't know what to say. I felt a lump in my throat as I pulled her into a hug. "Are you sure?" I asked. She smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything." Emily moved back to Seattle a month later. We got an apartment together, a tiny one-bedroom with creaky floors and a leaky faucet, but it was ours. A year after that, I proposed to her in that same bookstore where we met. I'd arranged with the owner to set up a little display with our favorite books and a sign that read, "Will you marry me?" She cried when she saw it, and I cried when she said yes. Now, we're planning our wedding. It's going to be small, just close friends and family, in a little garden surrounded by fairy lights. Every time I look at Emily, I think about how lucky I am to have walked into that bookstore on a snowy evening. Life has a funny way of surprising you. Just when you think you're stuck in a routine, something or someone comes along and turns your world upside down. For me, that someone was Emily. What do you think? Let me start by saying I was not looking for love when this happened. In fact, if you told me 4 years ago that one of the most embarrassing moments of my life would lead to meeting the love of my life, I would have laughed in your face. But life has a funny way of surprising you, doesn't it? It all began on a freezing December morning in New York City. I'd woken up late for work and was already running on 3 hours of sleep, thanks to a work project that kept me up until 2 a.m. As I dashed out of my apartment, I realized I'd forgotten to grab my lunch. No big deal. I figured I'd grab a bagel and coffee from the deli near my office. I ordered my usual, an everything bagel with cream cheese and a large black coffee, and reached into my bag to grab my wallet, and it wasn't there. Cue the panic. The line behind me was long, and the cashier was staring at me impatiently. I think I left my wallet at home," I stammered, feeling the heat rise to my cheeks. Before I could even process my next move, the person behind me, a tall guy with dark, curly hair and the kindest eyes I'd ever seen, stepped forward. "Don't worry about it," he said, pulling out his card. "I got this." I turned to him, mortified. "Oh my God, no, you don't have to do that." He just smiled. "It's no big deal. We've all been there." I thanked him profusely, promising to pay him back somehow. He waved it off with a casual, "It's just a bagel." I figured that was the end of it, but as fate would have it, I ran into him again later that day. Around lunchtime, I was heading to the subway when I saw him sitting on a bench near the entrance, munching on a sandwich. Our eyes met, and he gave me a small wave. "Bagel lady," he called out, grinning. I couldn't help but laugh. "You're not going to let me live that down, are you?" We started talking, and I learned his name was Liam. He worked as a software developer and had a knack for photography, which he said was more of a hobby than a career. "You're really good at saving damsels in distress," I joked, gesturing to my bagel. "Well, if you call forgetting your wallet distress, you've had a pretty easy life," he teased back. There was something about him, his easygoing demeanor, his quick wit, the way he listened intently when I spoke. It was refreshing. Before we parted ways, Liam asked, "How about you let me buy you dinner instead of paying me back for the bagel?" I was so caught off guard that I stammered, Yeah, sure, why not?" Our first date was at a tiny Italian restaurant in the West Village. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect. Over plates of spaghetti and glasses of cheap wine, we talked about everything. Our favorite movies, childhood memories, embarrassing moments. I told him about the time I accidentally called my professor Mom in college. He nearly choked on his wine from laughing so hard. By the end of the night, I knew this wasn't just a casual date. There was something special about Liam, something I couldn't quite put into words. Over the next few months, we grew closer. Liam had this way of making every moment feel extraordinary, whether it was a spontaneous picnic in Central Park or a lazy Sunday binge watching old sitcoms. He was the first person I'd ever met who truly understood me, my quirks, my insecurities, my dreams. He encouraged me to pursue my passion for writing, even when I doubted myself. "I see how your face lights up when you talk about your stories," he told me one night. "You owe it to yourself to chase that." Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. About a year into our relationship, Liam was offered a job in San Francisco. It was a huge opportunity for him, but it meant we'd have to do long distance. I remember the night he told me. We were sitting on my couch, Olive, my cat, curled up between us. "I don't want to lose this," he said, his voice trembling, "but I also don't want to hold you back." I took his hand and said, "We'll figure it out. We always do." Long distance was hard, but we made it work. We'd FaceTime every night, send each other care packages, and take turns flying across the country to visit. One weekend, while I was visiting him in San Francisco, we were walking along the Golden Gate Bridge when Liam stopped me. "You know," he said, looking out at the water, "I've been thinking a lot about us. About how even when things are tough, I never want to give up on this." Before I could respond, he pulled out a small velvet box from his pocket. "I want to build a life with you, no matter where we are. Will you marry me?" I was so overwhelmed I couldn't speak. I just nodded as tears streamed down my face. Now we're married and living in a cozy apartment back in New York. Liam ended up finding a remote job so we could be together, and I finally took the leap to publish my first novel, something I never would have done without his support. Sometimes, I think back to that day in the deli and wonder how different my life would be if I hadn't forgotten my wallet. It's funny how one small, seemingly insignificant moment can change everything. Liam likes to joke that he's still waiting for me to pay him back for that bagel. I always tell him, I think I made it up to you by saying yes. What do you think? Would this story make the front page of r/relationships or r/true love? I never expected my life to change during an ordinary Monday commute. But sometimes, the universe has a way of throwing you a curveball when you least expect it. 4 years ago, I was just another 29-year-old software engineer in Seattle, stuck in a rut. I worked long hours at a tech company, lived alone in a small apartment, and spent my evenings binge-watching shows I'd seen 100 times. Romance? Not even on the horizon. Then came the bus ride. It was raining that morning, typical Seattle weather. I'd been running late, juggling my umbrella, coffee, and laptop bag, and barely caught the Route 28 bus as the doors were closing. The only seat left was next to a woman wearing a bright yellow raincoat. I almost didn't notice her at first. I was too busy trying to dry off my glasses and get settled without spilling coffee on myself. But then I glanced over, and she was smiling at me. "Rough morning?" she asked, her voice warm and teasing. I let out a nervous laugh. "Is it that obvious?" She grinned and gestured to the puddle I'd unknowingly created on the floor. "Just a little." That was how I met Sophie. We started talking, and I learned that she was an elementary school teacher who loved painting, baking, and, oddly enough, medieval history. She was witty, easy to talk to, and had this infectious energy that made me forget about the miserable weather and my stressful morning. When her stop came, she stood up, smiled, and said, "Maybe I'll see you on the bus again?" I nodded like an idiot, unable to say anything clever. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Every morning, I found myself scanning the bus for her bright yellow raincoat. It took a week, but one rainy Tuesday, she got on at her usual stop. This time, I made sure to say hello first. Sophie and I quickly fell into a routine. We'd talk on the bus every morning, sharing stories about our jobs, hobbies, and the little quirks of city life. She told me about her students' hilarious antics, and I told her about the frustrating bugs I was trying to fix in my code. I started looking forward to those bus rides more than anything else in my day. They were a bright spot in my otherwise gray life. One morning, Sophie surprised me by handing me a small, hand-painted card. "I made this for you," she said, a little shyly. The card had a watercolor painting of a bus with raindrops streaking the windows. Inside, she'd written, "Thanks for making my mornings a little brighter." I was floored. No one had ever done something so thoughtful for me. That weekend, I mustered up the courage to ask her out for coffee. To my relief, she said yes. Our first real conversation outside the bus felt just as easy and natural as our morning chats. Over steaming mugs of coffee, we talked for hours about everything: our favorite books, childhood memories, and dreams for the future. By the end of the date, I was completely smitten. Over the next year, Sophie and I became inseparable. We explored the city together, spent lazy weekends baking cookies, well, she baked and I mostly sampled, and even took a spontaneous road trip to the Oregon coast. She taught me to see the beauty in small moments, like the way sunlight hits a puddle just right, or how comforting a quiet evening with someone you love can be. In turn, I helped her embrace her nerdy side. We spent hours playing board games, and she even joined me at a tech convention once, though she laughed at how excited I got over the newest VR headset. But every great love story has its challenges, right? For us, it came when Sophie was offered her dream job teaching art in a prestigious school in Chicago. When she told me, I felt like my world was crashing down. I didn't want her to go, but I also knew I couldn't stand in the way of her dreams. "Do you think we can make long-distance work?" she asked, her voice trembling. I took her hands and said, "I think we can make anything work, as long as we don't give up on each other." The next 2 years were tough, but we made it through. We visited each other as often as we could, spent countless nights on video calls, and sent each other care packages filled with little reminders of our lives. Every time we reunited, it felt like no time had passed at all. Then one evening, while we were walking along the waterfront during one of her visits, I stopped and pulled out a small box. "Sophie," I said, my voice shaking, "I don't want to spend any more mornings without you by my side. Will you marry me?" She burst into tears and nodded, throwing her arms around me. Now, 3 years later, we're happily married and living in a sunny apartment in Chicago. I work remotely now, and Sophie teaches at her dream school. We still take the bus sometimes, just for nostalgia, and she even keeps that little card she painted for me on our bookshelf. Looking back, it amazes me how one rainy morning and an awkward bus ride led to the greatest love of my life. Sometimes, the best things in life happen when you're least prepared for them. If you told me 5 years ago that a wrong turn in a bookstore would lead me to the love of my life, I wouldn't have believed you. But that's exactly how it happened. At the time, I was a 27-year-old graphic designer living in Austin, Texas. My life wasn't bad by any means, but it felt incomplete. I had good friends, a solid job, and hobbies to keep me busy, but something was missing. I chalked it up to being single for longer than I cared to admit. I wasn't actively searching for love, though. I had been burned a couple of times and decided to focus on myself. But life, as it often does, had other plans. It all started on a quiet Saturday afternoon. I had wandered into my favorite local bookstore to browse and pick up a new journal. I was heading toward the art section when I turned down the wrong aisle and found myself surrounded by travel guides. That's when I saw him. He was sitting on the floor, flipping through a thick book about Japan, his brow furrowed in concentration. I tried to slip past without disturbing him, but as I did, the bag on my shoulder knocked a stack of books off the shelf. The sound was deafening in the otherwise quiet store. "Oh no, I'm so sorry," I blurted, crouching down to pick them up. The man looked up, startled, but then he smiled, a warm, lopsided smile that made my stomach flip. "No worries. Happens to the best of us." I laughed nervously and handed him one of the books I'd knocked over. It was about Kyoto. "Planning a trip?" I asked, mostly to distract myself from how flustered I felt. He nodded. "Hopefully. I've been dreaming of visiting Japan for years, but I've never quite gotten around to it. What about you?" "Have you ever been?" We ended up talking right there in the aisle for over an hour. His name was Alex, and he was a 30-year-old architect with a passion for travel, photography, and cooking. He told me about his dream of wandering through Tokyo's neon-lit streets and hiking in the serene forests of Kyoto. I shared my love for art and design and confessed that I'd always wanted to visit Europe, but had never taken the leap. Before we knew it, the bookstore's staff announced they were closing. "I guess we lost track of time," Alex said, looking a little sheepish. "Can I buy you a coffee? Or maybe a late-night snack? I feel like this conversation isn't finished." I hesitated for a moment. I wasn't the type to say yes to a near stranger, but there was something about Alex that felt safe, genuine. "Sure," I said, surprising even myself. That night, over coffee and pastries at a nearby cafe, I learned so much more about Alex. He was kind, curious, and had a knack for making me laugh so hard I almost spit out my drink. Twice. When he walked me to my car afterward, he paused and said, "This might sound forward, but can I see you again?" I smiled. "I'd like that." Our first official date was a week later, a picnic at Zilker Park. Alex showed up with a basket full of homemade sandwiches and a bottle of wine, and I brought a sketchbook in case inspiration struck. We spent the afternoon lying on a blanket, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about his family, his parents, who had retired to Arizona, and his younger sister, who was a teacher in Chicago. I told him about growing up in a small town and how moving to Austin felt like stepping into a whole new world. At one point, as the sun was setting and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Alex looked at me and said, "I feel like I've known you forever." I felt the same. Over the next year, Alex and I became inseparable. He introduced me to his world of architecture and travel, and I introduced him to my love of art and design. We cooked meals together, he was an incredible chef, explored Austin's hidden gems, and even started planning that trip to Japan he'd always dreamed of. But it wasn't just the big moments that made me fall in love with him. It was the small ones. The way he'd leave me little notes on my desk when I was working late, or how he'd hum off-key while washing the dishes. The way he genuinely listened when I talked about my day, no matter how trivial it seemed. Of course, like any relationship, we had our challenges. One of the biggest came when Alex was offered a job in San Francisco. It was a huge opportunity, but it meant moving halfway across the country. When he told me, I felt my heart sink. I didn't want him to go, but I also didn't want to be the reason he passed up something so important. "I want you to come with me," he said one night, his voice quiet but steady. The idea terrified me. Leaving Austin meant leaving behind my friends, my job, and the city I'd grown to love. But the thought of being without Alex scared me even more. So, I took a leap of faith. We moved to San Francisco together, and though the transition wasn't easy, we made it work. I found a job at a design firm, and Alex thrived in his new role. We explored the city together, from the bustling streets of Chinatown to the serene beauty of Golden Gate Park. 2 years later, on a rainy afternoon in Kyoto, Alex proposed. We were standing on a bridge overlooking the Kamo River, umbrellas in hand, when he turned to me and said, "This trip wouldn't mean half as much without you. You've made my life better in every way. Will you marry me?" Through tears, I said yes. Now, 5 years after that fateful day in the bookstore, we're happily married and living our dream. We've traveled to over a dozen countries, cooked countless meals together, and even adopted a dog named Mochi. Looking back, I'm still amazed at how one wrong turn in a bookstore led me to the greatest adventure of my life. Sometimes love finds you when you least expect it. And for that, I'm endlessly grateful. I've always been someone who loved the rain. There's something poetic about it, the way it washes everything clean and forces you to slow down. But I never expected a rainy afternoon to completely alter the course of my life. It was mid-October, one of those days where the weather couldn't make up its mind. The morning was sunny, so I left my umbrella at home, only for the sky to open up just as I was leaving work. By the time I reached the bus stop, I was thoroughly soaked. My laptop bag was dripping, my hair was plastered to my face, and my heels were squelching with every step. I stood there, shivering and cursing my bad luck, when a voice broke through the sound of the downpour. "You look like you've had better days." I turned to see a man standing under a large black umbrella. He had a friendly smile, slightly tousled dark hair, and the kind of warmth in his eyes that instantly put me at ease. "You could say that," I replied, laughing despite myself. Without hesitation, he stepped closer, holding the umbrella over both of us. "Here," he said, "we can share until the bus gets here." We started chatting, and I quickly learned his name was Daniel. He was a 32-year-old architect who worked a few blocks away from my office. He had an easygoing charm and a quick wit that made me forget all about the rain and my miserable state. By the time the bus arrived, I was genuinely disappointed to part ways. But as I stepped on, Daniel handed me a small piece of paper. "In case you ever need an umbrella buddy again," he said with a grin. The paper had his name and number written in neat handwriting. I'll admit, I hesitated to text him at first. It had been a while since I'd been in a relationship, and I wasn't sure I was ready to put myself out there again. But something about Daniel felt different. Safe, kind, unassuming. So, a week later, I worked up the nerve to send him a message. "Hey, umbrella buddy, this is Maya. Any chance you're free for coffee this week?" His reply came almost immediately. "For you? Always." Our first date wasn't even officially a date. It was just coffee at a small cafe near my office. But something about it felt effortless, like we'd known each other for years instead of a week. We talked for hours, moving from coffee to tea and eventually splitting a slice of chocolate cake. I learned that Daniel had grown up in Chicago but had moved to my city for work 3 years ago. He loved photography, hiking, and cooking, though he admitted his cooking experiments didn't always go as planned. When we finally said goodbye, he gave me that same warm smile he had at the bus stop. "This was fun," he said. "Let's do it again soon." Soon turned into dinner dates, weekend hikes, and countless late-night phone calls. Daniel and I quickly discovered how much we had in common, from our love of books and travel to our mutual disdain for pineapple on pizza. Don't come for us. But what really drew me to him was his thoughtfulness. He remembered the little things, like how I took my coffee or my favorite type of flowers. On particularly stressful days at work, he'd surprise me with small gestures, a text saying, "You've got this," or a playlist he made just for me. About 6 months into our relationship, Daniel introduced me to his family during a weekend trip to Chicago. I was nervous, but his parents and younger sister welcomed me with open arms. That trip was also when I realized just how deeply I cared for him. Watching him interact with his family, teasing his sister over board games, helping his mom in the kitchen, I saw a side of him that made me fall even harder. Of course, no relationship is perfect. Daniel and I had our share of challenges. One of the biggest came when I was offered a promotion that required me to move to a different city. It was a huge career opportunity, but it also meant putting 200 miles between us. When I told Daniel, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm not going to lie. This sucks. But I want you to take it. You've worked so hard for this, and I'll support you no matter what." Long distance wasn't easy, but we made it work. We visited each other as often as we could and had weekly date nights over video calls. There were tough moments, miscommunications, missed visits, but every time we found our way back to each other. After a year of long distance, Daniel surprised me by showing up at my door with a moving truck. "I've been thinking," he said, grinning as he pulled me into a hug. "Wherever you are, that's where I want to be." Now, 3 years later, we're living together in a cozy apartment with a dog we adopted. His name is Rainy, fittingly. Daniel still teases me about that day at the bus stop, saying it was fate that I forgot my umbrella. And maybe he's right. Sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected moments. Would this story fit on Arsh relationships or Arsh true love? It all started with a Facebook message. About 3 years ago, I got a message from a girl I vaguely remembered from college. Her name was Emily. We had a couple of mutual friends and had exchanged maybe 10 words during a group project years ago. Honestly, I didn't even realize we were friends on Facebook. The message was short and to the point. "Hey, this is super random, but would you be willing to be my +1 for a wedding? It's in 2 weeks, and I promise it's not as weird as it sounds." I wasn't sure how to respond at first. Was this a prank? A dare? But curiosity got the better of me, and I replied, Sure, but I need some context here." Emily explained that her cousin was getting married, and her family was notoriously nosy about her love life. Or, as she put it, my non-existent love life that they won't shut up about. She'd made the mistake of telling her mom she was dating someone to get them off her back. Now, she needed someone to fill that role. "You're literally the only person I could think of who might be game for this," she added. No pressure, though. To this day, I don't know why I said yes. Maybe it was boredom, or maybe I just wanted to help her out. Either way, 2 weeks later, I found myself driving to a small town 3 hours away, wearing my best suit and rehearsing fake couple stories in my head. Meeting Emily again after all those years was unexpected. She looked different from how I remembered her. More confident, with an easy laugh that immediately put me at ease. She greeted me with a tight hug and whispered, "You're a lifesaver. I owe you big time." We quickly ran through the basics: how we met at a coffee shop, how long we'd been dating, 6 months, and the kind of couple we were, goofy and laid back. The wedding was beautiful but chaotic. Her family was exactly as she'd described: nosy, loud, and a little overbearing, but also incredibly warm and welcoming. Emily introduced me as her boyfriend, and I played the role like a pro. I complimented her dress, held her hand, and even danced with her aunt during the reception. But somewhere between the staged glances and fake laughter, something shifted. I started noticing the little things about her. The way she wrinkled her nose when she laughed, how she tilted her head when she was listening intently, and the way she genuinely cared about her family, even when they drove her crazy. By the end of the night, I wasn't pretending anymore. As we were leaving, Emily turned to me and said, "I can't thank you enough for this. You were amazing." I grinned. "You make it sound like an audition. Did I get the part?" She laughed, and for a moment there was this pause, like we both realized something had changed. We kept in touch after the wedding. It started with casual texts, inside jokes about her family, memes, and random updates about our lives. But over the next few months, our conversations became deeper. We talked about our dreams, fears, and everything in between. One night, after a particularly long phone call, Emily said, "You know, if someone had told me a fake date would turn into this, I would have called them crazy." That was the moment I knew I was falling for her. Our first real date wasn't anything fancy, just pizza and a walk by the lake. But it felt perfect. We didn't have to pretend or play roles. It was just us, and that was enough. Over the next 2 years, Emily became my best friend, my biggest supporter, and the love of my life. We traveled together, survived a pandemic together, and even adopted a grumpy rescue cat named Watson. Last month, we went back to the same small town for her cousin's anniversary party. As we were walking through the garden where the wedding had taken place, I pulled out a ring and said, "So, how about we stop pretending?" Emily stared at me, her eyes wide. For a second, I panicked, thinking I'd misread the moment. But then she tackled me with a hug, laughing and crying at the same time. "About time," she said, grinning through her tears. Now, we're planning our own wedding, and her family loves to remind us that they totally called it. Sometimes life surprises you in the best possible way. What do you think? Would this make it to r/relationships or r/true love?